The hard way when he saw the dust cloud rising from the eastern ridge. 5 fast-moving riders were on their horses when the dust cloud appeared. They rode their horses across his land, their intentions written violently in sweat, and he was repairing fence posts near the creek when the Warlands caught his chief Takakota's grandfather's lance leaning against his porch where he'd placed it that morning, while cleaning the eagle feathers the sight of it should have filled him with pride, the only white man in territorial history to carry Apache honor. Instead it sent ice water through his veins because those riders weren't coming for a friendly visit. Tobias dropped his hammer and reached for the rifle he'd started carrying again last week, ever since Deputy Bradley had mentioned the rumors in the town, rumors about people asking strangers questions about the rancher who helped an Indian escape punishment, strangers who weren't happy with the official story about Marshall Webb's corruption trial. He had never seen the lead rider before. He was tall, lean, and had pale eyes that suggested violence was coming to him. But it was what he carried across his saddle that made Tobias's blood freeze to the point of being bloody, blood-stained Apache headband, fresh blood, still dripping. The man reined in his horse 20 feet from the porch, close enough for Tobias to see the cruel smile spreading across his weathered face, close enough to hear the metallic click of 5 weapons being cocked simultaneously. "You Tobias Hartwell?" Despite the fact that the stranger's tone suggested he already knew the response. "Depend who's asking." The man's grin widened, revealing teeth stained yellow with tobacco. "Name's Clayton Morrison. Colonel Morrison was my brother." He held up the blood-stained headband like a trophy. "And this belongs to your Apache." Tobias, his murder friend, felt the world shift in Ayana's direction. Written out 3 days ago on a diplomatic mission to the Southern Territories, he was supposed to return tomorrow with news about the peace treaty being extended. He was supposed to be safe and protected by federal marshals who were escorted by the government. But that headband told a different story, a story written in blood. Where is he? Tobias demanded, though he wasn't sure. He wanted to know the response, and Clayton's eyes sparkled with joy. "You'll never find him, unless, of course." Tobias felt his heart pound against the words, which hung in the air like a death sentence. "You're willing to make a trade." His ribs, as the implication sank in these men, hadn't come for revenge. They'd come to finish what Marshall Webb had started, and they had Ayana. But what Clayton Tobias thought he knew everything there was to know about Justice Brotherhood and the cost of choosing sides in a war that was supposed to be over. "The trade is simple." Clayton continued dismounting. "You killed my brother's reputation, destroyed his," she said with the casual confidence of a man who held all the cards. In front of the entire territory, legacy made him appear to be a crooked fool. Tobias gripped his rifle tighter, though, with 5 guns trained on him. It felt about as useful as a wet match. Your brother was corrupt. The evidence proved that. Evidence provided by a lying savage. Clayton spat evidence that convenient appeared after Morrison was already dead, and couldn't defend himself. His pale eyes burned with the kind of hatred that had been festering for months. "But I'm a fair man. I'll give you a chance to make it right." One of Clayton's men, a stocky killer with a scar running from his left ear to his jaw, leaned forward in his saddle. "Just say the word, Clay, we can end." "This is Patience Tucker," Clayton's response, and he didn't look at Tobias. Mr. Hartwell must first comprehend his options. He pulled a folded piece from his saddlebag. "Paper, this is a pre-written confession that only requires your signature. It states that you fabricated the evidence against my brother, that you conspired with the Apache to frame an innocent officer." That Tobias felt ill. "And if I sign this, you're Indian." Everything Webb admitted were lies he was forced to tell. "Clayton's friend lives. We ride away, and this awful situation is forgotten." Smile turned prey-like. "And signing it also means admitting to federal treason and the hanging crime. But hey, at least you'll die knowing you did the right thing." The confession fluttered in the evening breeze like a death warrant. Tobias was able to clearly see the trap now, so he signed the document, cleared Morrison's name. But he also destroyed himself and could have restart the war between settlers, and Apache refused to sign and watch Ayana die for crimes he'd helped expose. "How? Do I know he's even alive?" Tobias inquired. And Tucker pulled something out of his coat that made his knees go weak. A leather cord with 3 Apache prayer beads, the same cord Ayana wore around his neck, the same beads his mother had given him before she died. "He was alive when we took this," Tucker said with obvious satisfaction. "Whether Whether he stays that way or not depends on your cooperation. Tobias thought about the last conversation he'd had. With Ayanna 3 days ago, the Apache warrior had been excited about the southern negotiations, hopeful that peace could. Spread beyond their small corner of the territory, he'd clasped Tobias's hand and called him brother, promising to return. With good news now, he was somewhere in the hands of killers, probably bleeding, possibly dying, while Tobias stood helplessly in his own yard with a gun pointed at his chest. "You have 1 hour to decide," Clayton announced, remounting his horse. "Come alone, bring the signed confession, and your friend lives long. We'll be waiting at Devil's Canyon. Enough to see another sunrise, bring anyone else, try anything clever, and we'll send you a scout piece by. Peace." Tobias was left alone with the burden of an impossible situation as the 5 riders wheeled their horses and galloped away. Choice save Ayanna and damn himself, or protect the truth and let his brother die. But as he stood there watching the dust settle, Tobias remembered something Chief Takakota had told him 6 months ago. Something about how the greatest warriors weren't those who won battles, but those who found ways to win without fighting. And then all of a sudden he realized exactly what he needed to do, even if it meant going straight into hell with nothing. However, Tobias wrote a desperate plan devised by his grandfather's old cult that would either save them both or kill them. Hard toward town, the warren's mind racing faster than his horse's hooves as he was strapped into his saddle. Devil's Canyon was a perfect place to kill. Narrow entrance, high walls, and no exits. Tobias had one advantage over Clayton Morrison, who was not planning a prisoner exchange but rather an execution. He had learned their signal system during his 6 months as an adopted Apache. The killers were unaware of this system that had summoned 50 warriors to his ranch. That day Webb tried to murder Ayanna, the problem was time 1 hour or two. Made his choice in the space between heartbeats, not a charge, not retreat, but something the warriors of 2 cultures had taught him. Sometimes the greatest weapon was words spoken at exactly to reach the town, locate Deputy Bradley, and persuade him to assist. Apache, without starting a war that would destroy everything they built Main Street, was nearly empty when he roared into town, leaving behind him a storm cloud of dust. According to the few people who saw him riding an Apache, Warland stepped quickly out of his path, their faces showing the same mixture of respect and unease they'd shown for. In the territory, Tobias had become something of a legend over the course of several months. He was the white man who had made peace with the Apache, who'd exposed corruption in the territorial government, who carried the honor of 2 peoples, but legends he was learning also made excellent targets. He found Bradley at the sheriff's office, hunched over a stack of wanted posters. A young man had matured into his position of authority over the past 6 months. But the eager loyalty of someone who'd chosen to stand on the right side of history, Tobias Bradley stood and extended his hand. "Expect to see you in town today? How's the ranch?" They have a Tobias, Clayton Morrison, and 4 men. They want me to sign a confession in which I say I made up the evidence against Bradley's brother. Face became pale. Morrison has a brother, and he wanted Tobias to correct him. Revenge, they're holding Ayanna at Devil's Canyon, giving me 1 hour to decide between saving my friend and destroying. Everything we accomplished, the deputy's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon. We'll get Sheriff Mackenzie round. Up opposing no time, Tobias interrupted. And too dangerous, they see any riders coming. They'll kill Ayanna before we can shoot them, he thought, pausing to look at Bradley's face. But there's another way. Tobias quickly grabbed a piece of paper and began writing. "What do you need?" Bradley leaned forward. "Miguel Santos at the trading post. Tell him it's from Brother Wolf. He'll understand." Chief Takakota. Immediately, what does it indicate? That the white brother requires assistance. That the piece has been stolen by enemies. Speaker that they needed to act quickly if they wanted to avoid war. Tobias folded the paper and put it in Bradley's hand. "Can you do this?" Bradley nodded grimly. "What about you?" "I'm going to Devil's Canyon alone like they asked Tobias." Checked his cult to make sure that all 6 chambers were loaded. However, Tobias, "I won't sign any confessions because this is suicide 5 against 1 in a canyon with no escape routes." "Maybe," Tobias replied, swinging back into his saddle. "But I couldn't do it because Ayanna put his life in danger to preserve peace between our peoples." Less for him as Tobias rode out of town. He felt Chief Takakota's war lance press against his leg. Grandfather had carried this weapon into countless battles, had used it to defend his people against impossible odds now. Tobias was the next to find out who he really was as a warrior, but what he found waiting at Devil's Canyon would challenge him beyond his bravery, because it would force him to choose between his brother's life and the future of two entire sincerely. People's Devil's Canyon got its name because of the narrow passageway that ran between towering walls of red rock. A vengeful god had shattered the earth, leaving behind a scar that would never heal. Tobias moved slowly, every instinct screaming, danger to Warlands, heavy in his grip the silence was wrong. The hollow echo of his horse's hooves was all there. No birds, no insects, and no wind. Clayton Morrison's voice echoed off the canyon walls. Before stone, even the animals knew this place was the Rire of Death. Tobias saw him right on time, Hartwell. I was beginning to think you didn't care about your Apache friend they had. Positioned themselves perfectly, Clayton stood on a ledge 20 feet up the canyon wall, rifle trained downward Tucker, and at the canyon's mouth, 2 additional men hid behind boulders, preventing any retreat. The 5th man was nowhere to be found, seen, which indicated that he was either guarding Ayana or watching from above. Where is he? Tobias called out, his voice steady. Despite the fear that was gnawing his chest, Safe Clayton responded. For the time being, bring the confession. Tobias pulled out a folded piece of paper from his coat. Not the confession Clayton wanted, but a letter that he had written in a hurry before leaving town, a letter that would inform the entire world exactly what had taken place here, matter how this ended. Show me Ayana first. Clayton gestured to someone. Tobias couldn't see a moment later. The 5th man appeared on the opposite ledge, dragging a bound figure into view. Even at this distance, Tobias could see the blood matting Ayana's dark hair. The way he slumped against his captor like a man. Despite being barely conscious, he was still alive, which satisfied Clayton inquired about. Now toss up that confession, and we can end the civilized like. Or came a new voice from the canyon entrance. You can. Everyone gave up their weapons and surrendered peacefully. At the sound, Deputy Bradley stood silhouetted. Clayton's face stood out against the evening sky, his badge reflecting the waning light, his rifle aimed at Tucker's back. I told you'd come alone, he twisted in rage. He did. Bradley called back. I acted on my own authority and followed him. I was sick of criminals thinking they could operate freely on my land. Tobias. Bradley felt his heart sink, but his presence had transformed a dangerous circumstance into a death trap. Bradley meant well. Clayton had no reason to keep Ayana alive now, and the canyon would become a place where everyone would die. Foolish boy. Clayton snarled, swinging his rifle toward Bradley. You just killed them both. That's when the arrow sprouted from the stock of Clayton's rifle, splintering the wood and sending the weapon spinning from his hands. Then another arrow appeared in the shoulder of the man holding Ayana, causing him to release his prisoner and stumble. Like spirits rising from the stone itself, backward Apache warriors appeared on the canyon rim. Not 50 this time, only 6, but perfectly positioned to fire at all Clayton's men with pinpoint accuracy. Chief Dakota's voice rang out in English, carrying the authority of countless generations. Clayton Morrison, you have attacked an Apache diplomat who was under federal protection, breaking the peace treaty. Now surrender or face. White Clayton wildly surveyed the surrounding area before giving in to man's justice. Recognizing that he had been outmaneuvered, he changed from the hunter to the hunter, from the trap to the cage, and his carefully planned revenge was collapsing around him like a house of cards. But desperate men don't surrender. Easily, Tucker raised his pistol toward Bradley, his scarred face twisted with killing rage. 2 other gunmen swung their weapons at the Apache positions, and the guard at Ayana applied pressure with a knife to the wounded warrior's throat. At that point, Tobias realized that despite their meticulous planning and their strategic advantages, all their righteous intentions meant nothing if everyone started shooting at once. If you were Tobias, what would you? Do you risk everything in a last-ditch effort to save Ayana? Or do you put your faith in the Apache warriors to deal with this without getting his friend killed? Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you'd choose, because what Tobias decided next would determine whether justice prevailed or whether Devil's Canyon became a graveyard for heroes. Tobias. Right moment, Tucker. He shouted, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd faced death before and lived to tell about it. Look around. You really look 6 Apache warriors with clear shots. A federal deputy with legal authority. and one rancher who's got nothing left to lose. Tucker's pistol wavered as scarred. Face showing the first flicker of doubt, you kill that deputy. You're not just fighting me, Tobias, continued Never. Taking his eyes off the man with the knife at Ayana's throat, you're fighting the United States government. You kill that Apache diplomat. You're not just breaking the law, you're starting a war that'll burn this territory from here to. When the arrow hit his rifle, Santa Fe Clayton spat blood from where he had bit his tongue. Hartwell, but we're done talking now, right? Tobias asked, reaching for the item slowly. Warland's affixed to his saddle, because I think you haven't heard the rest of my explanation. The movement caused every weapon in the canyon to move closer to him. But Tobias kept his cool and continued. See, I wrote a letter before coming. Here, Deputy Bradley's got a copy. So does Miguel Santos at the trading post so? Does Chief Takakota? He lifted the lance. The eagle feathers which caught the last rays of sunlight. Letter details everything about who you are and what you wanted, including how you took a federal diplomat hostage. Clayton's face went pale as you forced a lie with your letters already. On its way to the territorial governor and the federal marshal's office, and the newspaper in Santa Fe. Tobias smiled. Grimly, even if you kill all of us right here, right now, by tomorrow morning the whole territory will know exactly what. Clayton Morrison and his boys tried to do the man holding the knife to Ayana's throat looked nervously at his boss Clay. Maybe we should shut up, Clayton snarled, but Tobias could see the panic creeping. Into his pale eyes, the careful plan was unraveling, the perfect revenge turning. Into a public disaster. Here's what's going to happen. Tobias continued, raising the Warlands higher. You're going to. Ayana, let go. You'll ride out of this canyon, and keep riding until you're out of the territory. Going to pray that Chief Dakota's mercy extends further than mine does. And if we don't, Chief Dakota's voice answered from the canyon rim, speaking in Apache. The words rolled like thunder off the stone walls, ancient and implacable. When he finished, he translated for the white man. Below, he says, the choice is yours, justice under white man's law or justice. However, there will be justice under Apache law. At that point, the sound of hoof beatots approaching reverberated throughout. Not Apache ponies this time, iron shoes on stone moving fast. Federal. Reads the canyon. Cavalry by the sound of it. Before following you, I informed Fort Richardson. Bradley grimaced. They would be interested in learning about threats against a federal diplomat and Clayton Morrison's meticulously planned retaliation. Become a total disaster, surrounded by enemies, and his crimes were recorded by the federal troops are approaching, and his brother's reputation in the newspapers of the territory is about to be destroyed once more. But cornered animals were still the most dangerous, and what Clayton did next would prove that sometimes when men have, they decided to bring everyone down with them because they had nothing left to lose. Clayton Morrison's laugh was like a man's sanity finally snapping. It echoed off the canyon walls like the cry of a wounded animal, desperate and dangerous, and totally out of the ordinary. You think this is over? You think he screamed, spittle flying from his lips. One, my brother was worth 10 of your savage friends, and I'll be damned if I let him go to his grave branded a traitor. He quickly drew a concealed pistol from his boot, did not aim at Bradley, Tobias, or even the Apache, warriors above. Instead, he pointed directly at the individual who was holding Ayana, his own ally and the sole individual who was keeping the diplomat alive, Bobby. He shouted to the knife-wielding killer, you cut that Indian's throat right now, or I put a bullet in your spine. The act of a man who committed suicide was an insane suicide threat, lost all sense of reality, making the situation even more perilous. Bobby's eyes grew wide with terror as he realized his boss had gone completely mad. Clay, what do you do it? Clayton shrieked, cocking the pistol. Kill him, and let them try to prove my brother was corrupt without their star. Witness. Time seemed to slow down for Tobias in the same way it always did when life and death were on a knife's edge. He heard and saw Bobby's hand trembling on the blade. He also saw Clayton's madness burning in his eyes. The moment when the decision that would define everything that came was made, the approaching cavalry were getting closer, but not quite to the point. Came after Tobias hefted the Warlands, savoring the instrument's perfect balance, and thinking back to everything Chief Takakota had taught him about honor, sacrifice, and the cause of defending what was most important. The weapon had been carried into battle by generations of Apache warriors, had tasted the blood of enemies, and Protectors alike now would taste blood again. He threw the lance with every ounce of strength in his body, putting behind it not just his arm, but his heart, his soul, his absolute determination that Ayanna would not die in this godforsaken canyon. The weapon flew through the air like a bolt of lightning, its eagle feathers streaming, its gleaming iron point behind it toward Ayanna's throat. The impact pushed him off the ledge, sending the blade harmlessly away from his cut, short by the bone-on stone crack 20 feet below. But Clayton's gun was already moving toward Tobias's murder. Blazing in his pale eyes, "You killed my last chance, you Apache-loving scumbag, and I'll kill you now." The shot rang out like thunder in the narrow canyon space. However, Deputy Bradley had fired a bullet, not Clayton's gun. Through Clayton Morrison's heart before the madman could complete his turn, the corrupt revenge seeker dropped like A. Stone, his unloaded gun clattering across the canyon floor. Silence fell like a burial shroud over Devil's Canyon. The remaining two gunmen threw down their weapons and raised their hands, clearly wanting no part of their dead. Leader Insanity, the warriors under Chief Takakota, swiftly descended to save Ayanna amid the roar of cavalry horses. Grew ever closer, Tobias walked slowly to where his warlance had fallen, pulling it, free of Bob's lifeless body. The ancient weapon was unmarked, and it was ready to use again if necessary. However, he prayed to God. How he hoped that the fighting would soon be over. Ayanna was aided by two Apache warriors, managed a weak smile. Brother Wolf comes when called. He said an Apache, using the name of the tribe, had informed Tobias that, like always, family protects family, to which Tobias responded in the words in the same language that had been taught by Chief Takakota 6 months earlier, as federal cavalry poured into the canyon to clean after the fact. Tobias came to the conclusion that something far-reaching had taken place here, not just the defeat of criminals or the rescue of a friend, but also evidence that the peace they had labored so hard to achieve was more powerful than the hatred they wanted destroyed. But this victory came at a price that would be felt throughout the region for years to come, and what would transpire next would demonstrate whether justice had actually prevailed or merely won one battle in a war that would never truly end. The federal investigation that followed Devil's Canyon lasted 3 weeks and turned up evidence that shocked even the most cynical officials in the territorial government Clayton Morrison hadn't been. Acting on his own, he had received financial support from a network of war professionals who had made a fortune selling weapons to both sides of the Apache conflicts. Captain William Hayes, the federal marshal who led the investigation, found Tobias at his ranch. On a crisp morning in late October, the officer's face carried the weary expression of a man who'd seen too much. Corruption in too many places. We found Morrison's financial records. Hayes said, accepting a cup of coffee on Tobias's porch, payments from arms dealers in Chicago, gun manufacturers in Connecticut, even ammunition suppliers from as far away as Baltimore. Your friend's kidnapping was just the beginning. Beginning of what? Tobias sat down with his own cup, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Hayes grimly responded. They were planning to restart the Apache Wars. Not just here, but throughout the Southwest. Morrison's job was to eliminate Ayanna and frame the Apache for attacking federal diplomats would have given the Army justification. To violate every treaty and force the tribes to move to reservations. The scope of the conspiracy was mind-boggling, with dozens of men in positions of power all working together to profit from human suffering on an unimaginable scale. If Morrison had been successful at Devil's Canyon, thousands of people would have died in the wars that followed. Tobias asked, now we finish what you started 6 months ago. Hayes said, every name, every payment, every corrupt official gets exposed. The territorial governors already called for a complete investigation of the Marshal Service deputy Bradley's been promoted to. The most significant information, however, came at the conclusion of their conversation. There's an interim sheriff with full federal backing. Something else. Hayes said, reaching into his coat. President Taylor himself signed as the document was written on. Official White House stationery heavy paper that carried the weight of federal authority. As Tobias read, his hands began to shake. It was a presidential commendation recognizing his extraordinary service in preserving peace between the government of the United States and the Apache Nation, in addition to the formal recognition of his adoption into the Apache tribe, and granted him status as an official mediator between the two peoples. You're being offered position. Hayes explained, federal Indian agent for the entire Southwest Territory answer. Directly to Washington, work with tribal leaders to expand the peace treaties, make sure nothing like this conspiracy can happen again. 6 months ago, Tobias had been a simple man. He couldn't believe what he was reading as he stared at the document. Rancher who'd given water to a thirsty stranger. Now the President of the United States wanted him to help shape the future of an entire region. There's just one condition, Hayes added with a slight smile. Chief Dakota has to approve the appointment as if summoned by their authority. The government wants to ensure that you have the full support of the Trib. Conversation, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the ranch, but these weren't the desperate hoof-beats of men riding in anger or fear. These were the measured steps of a ceremonial procession. Chief Dakota rode at the head of a group of 20 Apache elders, all dressed in their finest regalia. Behind them came Ayanna, fully healed from his suffering, while carrying something that made Tobias' breath catch in his throat. A second language that was identical to his own already carried, but younger and unmarked by battle. The chief slowly mounted as we have come to, Brother Wolf. With ancient eyes bright with something that looked like pride, he said in perfect English, "Talk about your future." The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Captain Hayes had ever witnessed the Apache. Tobias was surrounded by elders who formed a circle, and each spoke about what they had seen and learned, what they believed about this white man who had chosen honor over safety time. And again, Chief Takakota spoke last, his words carrying the weight of decades of leadership and wisdom. 6 months ago, we gave you the lance of a warrior. Today we accept the lance of a peace chief, and you will become more than just a brother to our people. Guardian of the treaty that protects all our children. The second war lance was a masterpiece of Apache craftsmanship. The shaft was carved with symbols representing both cultures, eagle feathers intertwined with olive branches. Apache prayers written alongside words in English. At its point was inscribed a single word in both languages, peace. But this honor comes with responsibility. If you, Chief Dakota said, accept the white man's position, you must also accept our traditions. You will speak for both peoples. You will carry the burden of both peoples. And when the time comes, you will sacrifice for both peoples. Tobias looked around the circle of weathered faces, seeing decades of suffering and survival wisdom earned through loss and hope maintained against impossible odds. These people had trusted him with their most sacred honor. Ayanna had put her life on the line to save him, but she had chosen peace over vengeance, even though vengeance would have been easier. Except, he said, simply what followed was a celebration that lasted until the stars came out. Apache and white man relating stories about food and expressing optimism for a future in which their children would not face danger. Deputy Bradley arrived with news that the last of the arms dealers had been arrested in Chicago. Sheriff McKenzie brought word that the territorial legislature was drafting new laws to prevent corruption in the Marshal Service. But the most meaningful moment came when Ayanna presented Tobias with a gift from the Apache children, a drawing showing two figures standing together under a bright sun, one carrying a war lance, the other an olive branch, both protecting a group of small figures that represented all the children of the territory. They drew this, Ayanna explained, to show what they want. Their world to look like a place where the warriors fight for peace, not war. As the evening wound down and the Apache prepared to return to their village, Chief Takakota pulled Tobias aside for a private word. The white government will test you. He warned they will pressure you to choose their interests over ours, and our people will test you too. They will watch to see if power changes who you are. And if I fail, the old chief smiled, you gave water to a dying enemy. When it would have been safer to let him die, you risked everything to save one man when you could have saved yourself. You threw your grandfather's lance to protect a brother when bullets would have been easier. He clasped Tobias's shoulder. Men who make such choices do not fail. They simply find new ways to succeed. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel. After a period of 2 years, the Southwest Territory had established itself as an example of peaceful coexistence between settlers and indigenous peoples. The peace treaties included 17 different Apache bands and 3 Navajo clans, and 4 PBLO communities. Trade routes were secure, children attended integrated schools, and the territorial government had implemented the strongest anti-corruption laws in the United States. Tobias Hartwell, federal Indian agent and Apache peace chief, split his time between Washington meetings and tribal councils, always carrying 2 war lances, one for use in times of war and one for peacekeeping purposes. For peace, whenever possible, he married a school teacher named Sarah, who shared his vision of a better world, and together they raised 3 children who spoke both English and Apache fluently. Deputy Bradley became Sheriff Bradley, then Territorial Congressman Bradley. Carrying on the lessons he had learned about courage and justice, the Apache continued to prosper on their expanded reservation lands and took part in the expanding territorial economy. And on the anniversary of that first day, when a thirsty stranger stumbled, it was celebrated annually. Tobias would visit the old well on his ranch throughout his life and reflect on how everything had changed with a single cup of water, because ultimately, that is how the world really changes. Not through grand gestures or great battles, but by doing nice things that have a ripple effect like stones thrown into still water and make waves that eventually reach places you never imagined touching. Now, click on the video to hear a story even better than this one, where honor meets betrayal in the unforgiving landscape of the Old West, and one man's choice between loyalty and justice will determine the fate of an entire town. Click on the video.